Want to welcome everyone, say good afternoon. Our next speaker is going to be Howard Adelman. Howard Adelman is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at York University. He was most recently Adjunct Research Professor at the Key Center for Ethics, Law and Justice and Government at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. Previously, he was visiting professor at the Woodrow Wilson School of Policy at Princeton University. And prior to that, he was professor of philosophy at York University in Toronto. At York University, he founded and was the first director of the Center for Refugee Studies and editor of Refugee until the end of 1993. He has written or co-authored 10 books and edited or co-edited 22 others. He has authored 80 chapters and edited volumes, 99 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and 30 professional reports. In addition to his numerous and prolific writings on refugees, he has written articles, chapters, and books on the Middle East, multiculturalism, humanitarian intervention, membership rights, ethics, and conflict management. Professor Adelman's most recent co-authored book is titled Return No Refuge, published by Columbia University Press, and his most recent edited book is entitled Religion, Culture, and State, published by University of Toronto Press. He has his previous edited volume, Protracted Displacement in Asia, No Place to Call Home, was released in November of 2008 by Ashgate. Please join me in welcoming Professor Adelman.
Let me get a sense of any of your experience. Have any of you worked or lived in a refugee camp? Anybody? One. Which camp did you work in?
I lived in
Which one was it?
It was located in Serbia.
Oh. As a result, at the time of the Bosnia Herzegovina war? Okay. Well, we'll touch on that a bit. I recommend it to anyone. Instead of going to a little tight. Is that better? I recommend visiting a camp, if only to lose weight. It's a good spa. Last time I lived in Dadaab camp, I lost 18 pounds, so it's far cheaper than a spa, too. In the book Protracted Refugees that came out a couple years ago, we described, this was focused on Asian refugees, and there are about 6 million of the 8 million refugees around the world are in protracted refugee situations. That means they've been living in camps for about 10 years at least, some for 30 years. Kids are born in camps, brought up in camps, and never see anything else but a camp. And it's only very recently, in good part due to the American Refugee Committee, that pressure has been brought on the United States government, who's initiated with a couple groups resettling those refugees, partly because the Karen have effectively lost their part in the war in Myanmar to a ruthless military regime, and there seemed to be no solution. America initiated resettling the Karen refugees in the United States. They're taking about 50% of them. Canada's taking about 10%, and other countries are taking some of the rest. The same with the Bhutanese refugees. These are refugees from Bhutan who were kicked out of the country, originally Nepalese, settled in Bhutan, became part of the Bhutanese government country and citizens there, but were kicked out. There are other refugees that nobody takes. The Rohingya, for example, also from Burma, that nobody will touch because they have, they're Muslims and have a militant reputation. You have all these refugees around the world in which there seems to be no solution for. And it seems odd because the history of the post-World War was solving refugee situations. When I first became involved in refugees, I was running the student residences at the University of Toronto, the cooperative residences, and Canada took 37,000 refugees, Hungarian refugees. The United States took 38,000, and I was helping to provide housing for them. In '68, Canada took in 10,000 Czechs. In '72, Canada took in 7,000 Ugandan Asians when Idi Amin kicked the Asians out of Uganda. The Vietnamese was perhaps the biggest movement. The United States took 800,000. Canada took 160,000 Indo-Chinese refugees. These were refugees that were seen not to be able to be returned. They couldn't settle in the first countries, and there were agreements entered into that the countries of first asylum would take them in on the understanding that the first world countries would resettle them. That ended in the late '80s in the orderly departure program, in which they no longer would take refugees automatically from Indochina. There have been key differences that have happened in the last 20 years. One is in 1983, there was a big decision in Canada that refugees had rights to make claims and rights to hearings and rights to lawyers to make their asylum claims. And we used to have 300 people would arrive a year on average. Now 25,000 arrive at least, maybe 50,000 some years, to make refugee claims. That's been a big change because there have been much greater use of the asylum situation. But corresponding to that, there's been a greater resistance to taking refugees from overseas. It was mentioned that one of my books that came out this year was Religion, Culture, and State. And it's a book that deals with perhaps some of the things a lot of you teachers know about, is multiculturalism. And it's a very positive book about the practices, daily practices in Canada of ethnic groups getting along with each other, and how little incidents get manipulated by the press and by politicians to exacerbate conflicts. But by and large, they get along very well, and the processes of interculturalism and multiculturalism work very well. The other book that came out this year, just actually a couple weeks ago, called No Return No Refuge by Columbia University Press, is the one I'm going to talk about. It's essentially about, the theme is very simple. If you don't want to read the book, I'll tell you in a minute what it's about, and then you save the money. The book is simply about all the refugee conflicts. Most are a result of ethnic and religious conflict. And the book says that when refugees are a result of ethnic and religious conflict, they don't go home. They don't go back, in spite of the fact that UNHCR said the preferred solution for refugees is to return to their home countries. But we can't find incidents where refugees return to their own countries after, I'll give you some exceptions, after ethnic conflicts and religious conflicts. That's essentially the message of the book. There are exceptions. Rwanda was an exception. These were refugees, Tutsi refugees, kicked out when the Hutu took over as the majority population in Rwanda, and eventually about 300,000 Tutsi refugees fled. They returned, and they returned in 1990 by military force. And by 1994, in spite of the genocide that killed almost 1 million Tutsi within Rwanda, the Tutsi-led army that invaded Rwanda from Uganda won the war, and they returned. So you can return by force. If you have to fight your way back, that's one way to do it. The refugees who fled the United States, not from ethnic or religious violence, but from political differences, weren't allowed to return to the United States in the American War of Independence, and they settled in Canada. Most of them were kicked out of the United States because they were on the wrong side of the war, but they didn't try to get back because they got land in Canada. That doesn't happen these days. The tradition of settling refugees from conflicts has changed in the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, following Woodrow Wilson's dictum that each nation perhaps should have its own state, the official world policy up until 1948 was ethnic cleansing. The world endorsed ethnic cleansing as the way to deal with refugees. So that in the Turkish-Greek conflict, they forced populations apart and resettled them in each other's territories. There were other conflicts in which this was the same policy. That changed after 1948 and with UNHCR, in which the new refugee regime came into effect under the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, which was a policy of non-refoulement, that you don't forcefully send refugees back. And this was a response to what happened to refugees returning to the Soviet Union, was part of the Cold War battle, and the policy remains the same, the principle of non-refoulement. You don't return refugees by force to countries they flee from. So you have a dilemma, because in the cases of mass flight from war and violence, they don't count as asylum refugees. They aren't individually targeted for for persecution, which is the rights you get under UNHCR. So most refugees in the post-war period are not convention refugees. They're not refugees that have the right to asylum. They're people who flee war and flee general violence, but they don't flee individual targeted persecution. And so they make up the bulk, 98% of the world's refugees. Now there's another group of refugees, the Palestinian refugees. In 1949, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees was set up. That is for the 712,000 Arab refugees that fled and the 37,000 Jewish refugees who fled the war between Israel and the Arab states. As it turned out, the Jewish refugees were settled in Israel. The Palestinian refugees largely remained in camps, even in Jordan, where they became citizens, and Jordan made them citizens. This has been a pattern, and the pattern has been repeated over and over. And the only time there was a concerted effort to return refugees was in the war in Bosnia Herzegovina. There was a concerted policy of trying to reverse ethnic cleansing. And there was deliberate ethnic cleansing, and the policy was to condemn ethnic cleansing then, and this was seen to be as very bad, and they were going to do something to return them using the Dayton Accords. Only the Dayton Accords were set up in such a way that the controlling politicians were the ones most engaged in ethnic cleansing. That's the way the peace process worked out. And in the first and second phases of attempting to return refugees, everybody agreed that it was largely a failure if there was attempts to return them where they were minorities. In 2001, they claimed they found a successful formula for return and boasted success. We did research on that success, in quotes, and that's one of the chapters spends its effort on that research, examining that case. And you found that people did return in one sense, but did not return in another sense. They returned to repossess their houses and sell them and immediately left. Virtually no one returned to live. There were some exceptions, older people who had nowhere to go. There were 3 cities that were mixed cities where they returned to majority areas in those cities. But basically, the population did not return to live as a minority within a larger majority. This is the case all over the world. It's not just Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not just the Palestine-Israel situation. It's in Ethiopia, Eritrea, that war that started in just before the 21st century, there were large numbers of refugees, Eritreans living in Ethiopia, picked up in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, bussed out and dropped on the other side of the border of Eritrea. And Eritrea was a bit nicer to the Ethiopian refugees, just went around, told them there were no jobs left in the port because the port was no longer serving Ethiopia, and all the Ethiopians left Eritrea. None of them have been allowed to come back either way. Even in internal wars or internal conflicts that aren't wars, we can talk about Asia, various East Timor, and populations which are very similar, but there's ethnic differences as well. But say in Kenya, the difference between the Lao and the Kikuyu after the last election, after each election there's always been purging of the other populations and minority populations in their area, and usually they went back, wasn't so bad. Just some stores burnt, houses burnt, no big deal. But that wasn't true after the last election. It was a big deal, and they say the refugees returned, but we can demonstrate that in fact they did not return this time. And these are internally displaced persons, not formally refugees. It's true in Sudan. Darfur is a case of ethnic cleansing on a massive scale in which the Fur and Masalit, etc., have been pushed out by the Arab nomadic tribes who are themselves pushed out by environmental change as the desertification of the desert moves south, and their breeding grounds for their nomadic travels with their cattle wound up. They began to agitate and to take on the settled tribes, the so-called African tribes living in East Darfur and South Darfur and North Darfur. And they've been ethnically cleansed almost totally. It's been called by the American Congress, they had a 100% vote for it, that it was genocide. It isn't genocide. They're wrong, even if there was a unanimous vote. But it's almost like genocide. It's a massive ethnic cleansing, and they've been living in camps, and nobody's done anything significant except make lots of noise. Yep. Yes, genocide is a deliberate, intentional effort to exterminate all members of a group under your control. In Darfur, and it can be broadened to include exterminating the way of life, and that's how you can define the Darfurians as refugees if you bend it in that direction. But there were about 60,000 killed and about 140,000 additionally died because of the peripheral effects of the ethnic cleansing. But they could easily have exterminated a couple million people, and they didn't. That's not, you might say that's a compliment to the Sudanese government, but it's not much of a compliment. They've been ruthless in treating them that way. But there is a distinction made. I myself don't think it comes to genocide because I don't believe that was the intention of the Sudanese government. The Sudanese government's intention was to make room for the Arab nomads, to push them off their land and give the control of the wells to the Arab nomads, to get rid of a base for the Arab population, the African settled population in Sudan. Does that help?
It's hard to determine intention sometimes until
Well, even when the population's gone, you can use historical evidence to say what the evidence of the government was, but you're quite right, it requires research, it isn't self-evident. But sometimes the behavior can tell you. There's not much disagreement over the behavior. There's a lot of disagreement over the use of terminology. In the issue of the Palestinians is unusual because at the time of the exodus of the Palestinians, and these are the Arabs from Palestine and the Jews from Palestine, there was a deliberate policy of not settling and resettling the Palestinians. When UNRWA was set up, the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees, the intention was to resettle them. The United States helped fund it, Canada helped man it, and the goal was to use the experience of the Tennessee Valley Authority and resettle them in Iraq. The Arab countries resisted that because they had resisted Israel, and there was a determination to return by force. And they were right in a way, because if they wanted to return, that's the only way they could return. And that was the intent at the time, and therefore they didn't want to accept resettlement. This was enhanced in part by Count Folk Bernadette, who was the first mediator, who was assassinated by Shamir's gang, Shamir, who later became a prime minister of Israel, and on the thought, the delusion that he had been a British spy, but he wasn't. But in any case, he was assassinated, but he promoted and believed in, I should give you a little bit of background on Count Folk Bernadotte. The Bernadotte family are the royal family in Sweden. They were placed there by Napoleon. They were a French family, and placed there as part of his extended family to be the royal family in Sweden. And they became Swedes and the royal part of royalty in Sweden. And Count Folk Bernadotte himself was a black sheep in the family who moved to the United States in the 30s and went bankrupt a couple times, went back to Sweden, and they made him head of the Swedish Red Cross. And he made a name for himself in mediating population exchanges in Europe. And was appointed as the mediator in the Middle East. He was quite a vain man. One of the reasons he got shot easily is he always drove in either a white plane or a big white open limousine convertible. So it was an easy target. But he promulgated a belief and an idea that people naturally belong in their natural soil, which was ironic given his own family's background in Sweden, and therefore said that the Palestinians should be enabled to return. Didn't argue then for a right of return, but should be enabled to return provided they agree to live in peace. And that became the first proposition about the Palestinian refugees that largely over the years got translated into or rephrased as a right to return. And the right to return became the mantra of the Palestinians, and return as the first priority became the mantra of the United Nations High Commission of Refugees. In terms of the three permanent solutions, return, settlement in first country of asylum, or resettlement abroad in first countries of the world, the richest countries of the world, UNHCR preaches that the preferred solution is a return. But when you look at the 6 million of the 8 million refugees, if they're products of ethnic conflict and religious conflict based on our studies, there's no chance of return. It's just not going to happen. So you have a situation in which the preferred solution isn't the realistic solution. Now, one can debate this as a description, but not much, because the evidence is overwhelming. You can debate it a great deal more as a prescriptive operation. Just because they can't return does not mean that they shouldn't have the right to return. I'll take a case, for example, in Iraq, since the Americans play a great deal of responsibility for the ethnic cleansing or religious cleansing in Iraq. Since there was an invasion, and there were, in 1993, approximately 1.9 million Christians in Iraq. There are approximately 75,000 Christians left. A lot of Christians have fled. They will not go back. I'll predict it without much qualms. A lot of them are in Syria and Jordan. For various reasons, Syria and Jordan take them in. I could go into the reasons for that. But they don't give them citizenship. They just let them live out their lives with using their savings. They work illegally, some of them, but they have plights. The other group that was driven out of Iraq, and there's various kind of Christians from Iraq, Christians that go back to the oldest Christians community in the world. There are also the Palestinians driven out of Iraq because Saddam Hussein had favored them as a minority that supported his regime, and they were driven out of their homes, 300,000 of them. So you have these people driven out of their homes, and the question is, should you push right of return in the face of the empirical evidence that there's not likely to be any return unless it's by the use of force? If you adopt a universalist, human rights, cosmopolitan kind of principle, and you further add the principle that the right of return is part of that universal right, that everyone has the right to return to the country in which they were born, then you might make it a prescriptive apparatus. And a number of human rights agencies have made that leap. I haven't, because I take Hannah Arendt's principle of what human rights are, that human rights are rights that all human beings should have, but they rise out of your membership in a state, and it's rights in relationship to those states that you are a member. They are not themselves of a right of membership. And there is no right of membership. It doesn't exist. We all get our memberships by chance, by history, by all kinds of reasons, but not by rights. And it's in that context that there is no right to membership, and that, in fact, the most important decision, this conference is not just about refugees, it's about this meeting, it's also about immigrants. And the most important decision probably that any country makes, as Michael Walzer says, is who to accept into membership. And Canada, like the United States, has open principles of acceptance. It doesn't discriminate anymore. Canada used to be very discriminatory before '67, but doesn't anymore, and takes its rights to membership and gives membership on general principles, but still it confers that membership. No one has the right to claim membership in Canada. So the issue is, should refugees have a right to return? And I would argue that it's not a good idea in practice, because what happens is, on the principle of making it a universal right, the refugees suffer. When you even make it just a preference that they return, the refugees suffer. And that's why I return to the protracted refugee situations around the world. And we could go around the world to look at Somali camps, and Somali camps, at least they have a chance of returning because they're all Somalis and the same, even though they're from different groups, they speak the same language, share the same culture and religion, and they don't enter the same situation. If the war stops, they'll be able to return. But in the case of Southerners versus Northerners in Sudan, that isn't the case. In the case of Darfurians, et cetera, that isn't the case. And what we ought to be doing and planning for these refugees is making plans based on the principle that they're not going to go back. Therefore, that leaves two other choices: settlement in the first country of asylum or resettlement abroad. If you talk about settlement of this first country of asylum, 2 years ago we were in Geneva at the UNHCR meeting, and one of the senior people in UNHCR announced that their preference in the case of refugees in protracted situations, which was the theme 2 years ago of the meeting in Geneva, was a small group would be allowed to resettle. Most would settle in the first country asylum, and some hopefully would return, and that would take care of the refugees. And they talked about the Rohingya who had fled Burma not once but twice, and were largely living in Bangladesh. And the Bangladesh representative of Bangladesh stood up after the speech and said, yes, I'm summarizing, these aren't his words. He was much more diplomatic, as they all are in these contexts. But what he essentially said, are you kidding? You guys are nuts. We're one of the poorest countries in the world. Why should we take the Rohingya refugees? We're not going to take them. If you want them, they either go back or you resettle them. They're not staying here, period. So don't presume they're going to settle in the first country of asylum. And that was unsaid by a lot of other first country of asylum countries, because these are poor countries by and large. And they don't want the refugees. So you have a dilemma. If the countries of first asylum that carry the burden of the refugees, whether in Kenya with the Somalis or the Sudanese in the north in Kakuma camp, don't want them, but can't do much about them. They keep them in camp and they're fed by the international regime. They say, well, we're not going to integrate them. They're going to stay in camps. The West says, we will take a few about a good will, etc., but we're not going to take them. They should go home. And UNHCR agrees they should go home. But the empirical evidence says they won't go home. And you say, why does that have to be the absurd formula that relegates people to staying in, as the American Refugee Committee says, being warehoused for year after year after year? Or why is the solution found? If you take the normal solution of the West, which used to be the case in the 60s and 70s and 80s when we settled the Indo-Chinese refugees, the formula generally was America took about 50%, Canada took 10%. With the Indo-Chinese and the Hungarians, and sometimes we took more, and Canada got the Nansen Medal for it. But if you figure there's 6 million refugees that need resettlement because the first country of asylum can't take them, and the country of origin won't take them. If you had a 10-year program, that would mean settling about 3 million in the United States, settling about 600,000 in Canada, and over 10 years period, that's not a lot of people. 3 million people means 300,000 a year over 10 years, and the problem is solved. The countries of the West talk about burden sharing. But if you look at what their share of the burden is, it's money, and very little money. I'll give a little contest here. I'll have to take it, I'll take it in today's dollars. How much do you think money it takes to support a refugee in Dadaab camp in Kenya per year? Just give me some guesses. $300? 10 what? $10? No, that's no. It was in. Go ahead. In 90, when was I in Dadaab camp? I'm getting old. 2003, it was $146 a year. That's why you lose weight. You don't get enough to maintain yourself. If you don't get any outside support or can't figure out other rations, your rations are about, it varies between 1,300 and 1,600 calories a day. And of course, it's the same food day in and day out, never changes. And that alone makes you lose weight. The costs are relatively little. It costs just to return a refugee, and then when it was 146, probably about 200 today, it costs then to return a refugee to, say, Puntland or Somaliland, which were at peace. It was only southern Somalia that was at war. And one of the questions we had when we did our research, how come refugees from Somaliland and from Puntland are still living in these camps 3 or 4 years after they've requested repatriation? And what you learn is it costs UNHCR $700 then to return them. It only cost them $146 to feed them. And they weren't getting enough money, so they just backed up the return process. So even when refugees can return and want to return, they aren't returned because of a shortage of money. It's travel costs, organization, protection, and you have to give them, if you return them and you don't give them enough money to resettle and have housing and support the schools that are there, you then get resistance by the local population to any return because it presents a burden for them and they can barely afford to survive themselves. So that's why it costs more. It's not just the simple travel costs. So you have this situation in which the right of return is a meaningless aspiration. And why in our book we called it a right, R-I-T-E, to return. A right that was really a matter of nostalgia rather than any realistic program. Further, it's a right that becomes ritualized. In Lisa Malky's PhD study, she's now an important refugee scholar, but it was her original PhD thesis on Burundian refugees, in which she compared the Burundian refugees who had settled and stayed in camps and those who had gone to urban areas to try to integrate into the local population. The ones who went to the urban areas became progressive, part of Western values, adapted, etc. The ones Somalis, these were a study of Burundian refugees, but it's also true of Somali refugees. They start out just as an ordinary cross-section of people. The ones to go to camp become more and more conservative and begin to revere their old way of life in an unrealistic way. So that in Somalia, for instance, none of the girls in the 90s from Somalia would wear hijabs. If you go to the camps now, half of them wear hijabs. There's a whole return to a kind of protective culture, using religion, using their ethnicity sometimes, etc. And it creates a culture also resistant to change. You also have a situation, say, in the refugees from Serbia. These are the refugees in Serbia, Serbs who fled from Kosovo, who fled from Bosnia Herzegovina. We tend to think of the others because the Serbs were the bad guys in this game, according in the West. But the Serb refugees who fled from what's now Croatia, etc., and fled to Serbia, keep their refugee status. And they keep their refugee status even though they're Serbs and they're back home, because of right to return claims and economic claims that they want to make in the courts. So part of the way the system works is to perpetuate refugeedom, if you want, a refugee identity that doesn't help the situation. I think, in summary, the result of the study is that and it's a big study. It covers lots of cases in Asia, lots of cases in Africa, lots of cases in Europe. That if there's a general rule that unless you use force, if you're a product of a refugee from an ethnic and religious conflict, and the chance of returning home, except if you go to war, is virtually nil, with some small exceptions, then perpetuating an idea of a right to return is perpetuating a myth at the expense and on the backs of the refugees. And it's to avoid coming to really deal with the problem yourself, which requires, in the end, true burden sharing and beginning to introduce a program of significant resettlement if you really do believe that the solution to the refugees should be resolved permanently. Thank you, and I open it up to questions.
According to our previous speaker, according to you, there are 6 million refugees who are on a long-term basis. Well, according to our previous speaker, there are 47.7 million, 50.4 million of whom are refugees in camps outside of there.
Yeah, the definitions vary. For instance, of a protracted refugees, it's either 5 years in UNHCR terms, or it's used as 10 years. So it depends on what protracted is. But if you talk about the gross numbers, if you talk about that's a total of all refugees produced, in a way. And in some cases, they retain their refugee status, as I said about the Serbs, are counted as refugees, even though they're living back in Serbia. They still count as refugees. The Palestinian refugees, 2 million Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, are counted as refugees. So they include totals. So numbers of people who've been resettled often retain the title that they've been refugees. If you talk about the number of actual refugees in camps now, it's 8 million. If you talk about the actual number of internally displaced now, it's 12 million. And you can 12 million. There are more recently, and since Arab Spring, there's even more refugees produced by that, which I haven't included in those totals. Those figures that he's using are figures of gross numbers of refugees and not the refugees in camps that need to be dealt with. I'm talking about protracted refugees in camps only. The issue is about the Serbian refugees in Serbia, which you're familiar with, and the question is why they keep their status as refugees. And I think, if I heard your answer correctly, was that it wasn't only for economic reasons or even for just political reasons, but it was because they didn't have identify with Croatia anymore, which they may have fled from, or from those parts of Kosovo from which they fled. Was that your, I think?
They did, but it's just that they from what you said, how I understood it was that they wanted to keep economic claims back at their home countries, and that's why they kept their status. But in other words, if they live in Serbia, they wanted to keep claims back in Croatia or Bosnia. That's the reason why they kept the status in Serbia.
And your explanation was that they kept it for what reason?
Because they were not able to go home. They didn't have any claims. They didn't have any possibility of returning there.
And they kept their refugee status because there was no possibility of return? But you see,
In the case of Croatia, for example, there was a major problem. It still is because they are on the way of becoming a member of the European Union, and a lot of the property was not returned to the actual owners. So they were kept. They were prevented from the European Union from getting fully into the succession talks because of that issue. In Bosnia, there was a verdict of the High Commissioner who made the decision that everybody's property must be returned. And that was the case where many people went back and sold their property, reclaimed it and sold it. And that was the moment exactly when their refugee status in Serbia was eliminated. Once they reclaimed their property back in Bosnia, at least from what I know.
No, I think that's exactly accurate. In 2001, that's when the policy was introduced to, we started working on it. I worked on it directly on the claims process and trying to create a regime. I can tell you some background on it, some interesting background on why there were difficulties. Well, just a small story at the session we had in Geneva with the heads of each of the effective ministers running Bosnia Herzegovina and 3 outside advisors. One was from the International Monetary Fund, and in the meeting it turned out the big blockage came because the new currency that had been introduced into Bosnia Herzegovina they had used the labor theory of value. So whoever was owed wages got money in the new currency. And it turns out those who were owed wages were the militias who had done the ethnic cleansing. And so the ethnic cleansers got most of the money of the new currency, and it wasn't based on property. But that was one of the big hitches in that big fight to get a system of returning property. But by 2001, that had been introduced, and for those refugees who got the property, they went back and sold it and went on. In the case of Serbia, for instance, you have hangovers. The hangovers from Kosovo, in which Serbia won't give up its claim to Kosovo, so you can't have a settlement there, and therefore a property settlement, and there's pressure from the European Union to settle those things, as you indicated. If you want to get into European Union, this is the condition. You have to settle out and end the refugee situation. And there's a whole, the politics and economics are what complicates the settlement regime. In some areas with Bosnia Herzegovina, it largely worked. With Croatia, it's still a point of contention. And so that's the issue. I don't think we disagree at all. It's just I didn't fill it in enough. I'm sorry about that. The question was whether the violators, people who engage in large-scale violation, are part of the refugee population movement. And this is true in some cases. In the case of the Hungarians, it was the largest, where 10% of them had really criminal backgrounds, in fact. They didn't have military or political backgrounds, but were criminals, were released from the jail and got out. You have problems about that in many refugee populations. More often, it's used to abuse the refugees. In Canada recently, for instance, the Tamils who arrived off the shores of the West Coast were accused of being part of the Tamil Elam and the rebels in Sri Lanka. So far, I think on the whole ship, they've found maybe 3. So it's more often used as a way to abuse and blacken the names of all the refugees than a case of characterizing the general population. Yeah, in case of Libya, it's certainly possible to return because there's tribal differences in Libya, as you know, but it's not a significant big ethnic differences or religious differences. What happens, though, is if you look at a lot of the refugees from Libya, a lot of them aren't Libyans. A lot of them are Africans working in Libya, or even Asians working in Libya. And they can't go back, and they don't want to go back into a war situation. Secondly, even Libyans who fled end up want to stay in a more peaceful environment and get on with their lives. So you have these tensions between immigration and being refugees who can return. And it depends on what the policies of Europe will be in dealing with them. Yes?
Two questions. Nobody used the term exiles, and how is that official? Has it been banned or not used? And the second question was, there are some refugees from Czechoslovakia, Poland, who fled in 1944, 1945, who are still arguing for the right to return. And was this covered in your conference, or is that just old history?
Let me refer to both of them. Exiles are usually reserved now for elites who are kicked out. It's just a change in language. The language is very interesting over the course of things. For example, in '46, there was a huge debate in the United Nations. Were the leftover Jewish refugees in the camps that nobody wanted and nobody would take in? There were 200,000. This is after the Holocaust. And were they DPs or refugees? If they were classified as DPs, which they often called themselves DPs, if they were classified as DPs, the rule was they would be sent back to the countries of origin. None of the refugees wanted to go back to the countries of origin. The Jewish refugees didn't. And so though they called themselves DPs, they wanted to be classified as refugees. The big debate at the UN, led by the Britain, was to call them DPs, and the Arabs supported that because they didn't want them to settle in Palestine. The United States led the opposition and classifying them as refugees, and they got a majority, and they were classified as refugees. So the language becomes very important depending on how the language is used at the time. When you talk, we deal with the Czechs from 44, 45, because what you have to know is that in 45, all the Western allies were still involved in officially ethnic cleansing. You had the cleansing of, the worst ethnic cleansing was of the Germans after the war. 12 million Germans were ethnically cleansed from other countries. Now, it's true they were on the losing side and Nazis were bad guys and all the rest of it. But most of these were innocent populations who had been living in those countries for years. Czechoslovakia was one of those situations in which all the Germans were officially cleansed from Czechoslovakia. There were other groups who were removed forcefully, and because they were still operating on the pre-war principle, and we describe a number of cases in which the official policy was of ethnic cleansing and exchanging populations. Now, many years later, but even by 1950, ethnic cleansing, which that wasn't used till the Bosnia Herzegovina war in the former Yugoslavia. Before that, when it was really practiced, it was only begun to be seen as a bad thing in the 50s and 60s, beginning to be seen, and then officially gets cursed as the wrong thing to do and a bad thing to do. Like a number of other things that happen in the history of society. What it seems to be the right thing at one time, I mean, the United States is guilty of genocide with the Native Americans, and deliberate genocide, and there's a lot of cases of it. And I was one of the editors of the Encyclopedia of Genocide, which documents the cases. Canada too. All the native-born populations in Newfoundland were hunted down and killed. So genocide and ethnic cleansing are old practices. They're not just new ones. And when they were officially sanctioned, as they were in 44, 45, 46, and 47, you have lots of cases of them, and we document them in the book. We don't document all of them, but illustrative enough of them. Are we out of questions?